Hello and welcome. I'm Jon Wilde, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Gerard Evans, who I'm going to be interviewing about mindfulness, meditation, and hopefully getting a bit of his life story. So, hi, Gerard.
Hello, John. Hi, nice to see you.
Hi, and one thing that interests me about your story is that you clearly come from the punk generation. You were the singer in a fairly well-known punk band called Flowers in the Dustbin. I just wonder if punk itself is not particularly associated with meditation. In fact, perhaps the opposite. We perhaps rightly or wrongly associate meditation with the 60s, hippies, the Love Generation, and all that crowd. So I just wonder how your punk background led you to meditation.
I suspect it wasn't my punk background that led it to me at all, but maybe. I think it's fair to say that my interest in meditation came up sort of alongside it. But also, I suppose, if you're looking for parallels, for me, punk was about looking for something more, something beyond the experience of life that I'd been, sort of conditioned to expect, by all the kind of normal powers, parents, school, church, state, or, this whole idea of like growing up to sort of conform and have 2.2 kids and a mortgage and either wear a suit or work in a building site and all these kind of options. I always kind of had this really deep desperation almost that there had to be more than that to life, I think. And punk kind of flagged up some kind of way out that there was more in its enigmatic and beautiful way of kind of leaving everything to read between the lines, which is why there's so many different definitions of it, I suppose, and all of them are true, depending on who you are. So yeah, for me, I suppose it was, if there are parallels or if there is a kind of synergy of energy between punk and the whole kind of meditation way of life, rather than just sitting there not making a noise, just to be clear about that, then that would be it. This yearning for there must be more to life than this, really, I suppose.
I mean, now you're the co-founder of the Brighton Mindfulness Centre. Obviously, mindfulness, meditation, the big parts of your life. When did you start meditating?
I first started in the early 90s. It would have been about... Actually, do you know what? I sort of tinkered with it in the 80s when I was squatting. Mainly as a sort of... I'd forgotten about this. Mainly as a kind of attempt to sort of relax in what wasn't a very relaxing place to live, or way to live, really, I suppose. So I tinkered with meditation and sort of self-hypnosis, which I probably wouldn't have known much difference between the two when I was squatting in the 80s. I went back to it in the early 90s in a more kind of structured way, via a book which is still on my bookshelf, by Eric Harrison. I'm turning round. If my voice sounds different, I'm turning around to look at my bookshelf and try and see where it is, so I'll see what the title is. There we go. Teach Yourself to Meditate by Eric Harrison. And
right.
So I got into that in the early 90s, but in terms of mindfulness and a sort of deeper understanding of meditation, or a deeper philosophy, a personal philosophy of meditation, then much more recently, really, in the last 2 or 3 years, because I'm diabetic and I got an eye test through saying there was bleeding behind my eyes, which isn't in itself a traumatic state, but it can be the beginning of a traumatic state that could lead to blindness. So needless to say, that really quite frightened me. And one of the things the doctor flagged up was blood pressure, so I just thought, well, I need to relax, and meditation came to the forefront of my mind, and And so the difference between sort of now and then being the, the 90s, whatever, the early 90s, was the internet, really, because I could look up stuff and get all these different perspectives. And obviously on YouTube, you can look up meditations. And what I had never even realised, and this is the level of my naivety up to that point, was that the guided meditations existed. I didn't know that. All I'd done was read about stuff in books and then meditated either to silence or to music. So to my astonishment and inspiration, these guided meditations existed, so I started doing those, just like random ones on YouTube. The Honest Guys and Glenn Harrold, who will re-enter the story at some point, who's more of a sort of hypnotherapist type guy than a meditation going away. But I just started getting a real lot out of it, and this in turn led me to want to spread the word, in much the same as being into punk had made me want to form a band and do a fanzine and just be a part of it and be a part of moving it forwards. Same kind of thing, I suppose. So I started doing these interviews, of which this is a part, I suppose. This is part of the series. And and consequently met people like you and looked into specifically mindfulness as a secular technique and as a structured technique more. And so that kind of brings us to sort of where I am now, really, I suppose.
So in terms of structure, I mean, for the benefit of listeners, I mean, we did the 8-week course together, so as a qualified teacher I took you through the 8-week course. But before we did that, it struck me that you had your own structure, that you weren't, obviously you had this history of meditating, but you were listening to guided meditations, which has its own kind of structure, I guess. You kind of were becoming more and more aware of internet links and sites and various teachers. So there was a kind of structured forming. It sounds to me for a while.
There was certainly, there was certainly a kind of a philosophy in my head that was forming, and one thing that was almost criminal to leave out in the timeline I just described was Eckhart Tolle, because reading his Power of Now book particularly, and then the follow-up A New Earth, that was the actual kind of mind-blowing moment for me, really. That's the moment where meditation stopped just being a practice and started being something I folded into every part of my existence. I was going to say everyday life, but that's almost not enough to say, really. Just the idea of being present in the present, the idea of when you're present, you don't have to worry about the past or the future, and you don't have to build up resistance to things that essentially only exist in your imagination. I could fold that into, not just into kind of everyday occurrences, but into the way I thought about everything. So into the way I talk to people, into the way I respond to the way they talk to me, into the way I respond to somebody walking through a door you've held open for them and not saying thank you. And I just felt all this kind of inner stress and inner conflict just completely dissipating. And so I'm not even sure if structure's the right word, but that was just that was the real kind of mind-blowing bit for me. That was the bit where I felt this kind of surge of liberation, which again, I don't want to harp on about these comparisons, again was very similar to like when I first saw the Sex Pistols swearing on Bill Grundy, actually. Similar kind of thing, but without the naughtiness. This time it was just pure liberation.
I mean, Eckhart Tolle, seems to be a very important gateway for many people. Of course, he doesn't use the word mindfulness in either of those books, does he? But
no.
there are elements of the books, those two books, The Power of Now and A New Earth, that are clearly alluding to. They're talking essentially about mindfulness, but then they're full of other stuff as well, aren't they? Other, let's say, spiritual concerns. So, would you say this for you is a spiritual practice?
spiritual is a funny old word, isn't it? Really, it makes me think of like gospel choirs, which are all right. You know, I'm not saying that in a negative way, but it's a slippery word to pin down, isn't it? And if it's possible to be spiritual yet secular, then I suppose. But I'm always very aware with sort of semantics that you can kind of be concentrating on the finger instead of the moon, I think, with that sort of stuff. So ultimately, I suppose what I'm actually thinking deep down is I don't really care about words like spiritual, because I don't seek to define how I'm feeling, which isn't very helpful in an interview.
No, but it sounds to me that particularly in the last couple of years, let's say, and maybe particularly in the last year, that your perspective on life seems to have shifted. So if we remove spirituality from the equation, and let's say this isn't really about spirituality, because I don't really know what that word means. It's so impossibly vague as to be almost meaningless. But could you say a little bit about that? Has your perspective on life?
Absolutely, yeah. It's like this thing that was lurking at the back of my mind. That sort of, I suppose, the germ of it for me was this sort of feeling that the hippies in Haight-Ashbury in 1967 had got it right, but then very quickly it had gone so terribly wrong. But I could never get rid of the idea that they got it right initially, and that there was a sort of better future out there if we were prepared to kind of accept that. And then of course the harsh reality is that, you know, who would it have been back then? Ronald Reagan as governor of California or whatever was very much not prepared to accept that, and the events of '67 turned into the events of '68, etc. So there's always this thought at the back of my mind, because I was always fascinated by all that, although it's before my time, and then fascinated by songs like Imagine by John Lennon, which set the bar astonishingly high. But again, you know, the sort of the cynics have plenty of ammunition to wade in. And what's happened to me in the last year or two, I suppose, is that little kernel, whatever part of me was really fascinated by all that, has really come to the fore. Which doesn't mean I've sort of turned into a hippie. I don't mean that. I mean just that whole kind of loving kindness, which I suppose was what attracted me to the idea of the '60s hippies. Make love, not war, and all that sort of things. Loving kindness is how I've changed. In that I don't feel any shame or any doubt about the 100% positive power of loving kindness, which I suppose I alluded to before when someone holds a door, when you hold a door open for someone and they don't say thank you, to instead of sort of saying you're welcome in a loud voice and cynically, which is what I used to do. Now I just sort of reflect for a short while on, I've no idea what kind of a day they're having, I've no idea what kind of a life they've got, I've no idea why they didn't say thank you, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is that my response, if it can be one of loving kindness, wishing them peace, wishing them health, wishing them happiness, I don't suffer from that situation anymore. I just win. I win two ways. I win because I held the door open, and I win because I have wished them goodness.
So your life is less reactive? Is that fair to say, that you react less to situations? I
react differently to situations, certainly. I'm not sure I'd say less. I prefer differently. And I feel more sort of integrated within myself. I feel more whole. Integrity is a fascinating word, isn't it? Because what it actually means is whole, but it's been kind of diverted to mean honest. But I suppose there is honesty and wholeness maybe go hand in hand. And yeah, that's what I feel. I feel more whole. I feel like my outlook is not sort of fractured anymore, and it doesn't keep going off on tangents. I feel like everything has come into one whole, which is a really like peaceful feeling, and that is through mindfulness, which is absolutely shored up and fed by meditation. I think this idea that you can do mindfulness without meditation, perhaps, maybe, I don't know, maybe Eckhart Tolle or people who are that kind of involved can, but I need meditation in the same way a footballer needs training, you know, to be at the top of my game.
What about the people around you? Have they have people been surprised that you've taken that, not taken the meditation because you took the meditation a long time ago, but that meditation has become such a big part of your life? And if so, do people notice that you've changed? Because you obviously feel like your life has changed perhaps immeasurably in the last recent period, particularly the last couple of years. Funnily enough, I don't think, it's not to my face, people haven't really expressed any particular kind of, any particular surprise, I don't think. A lot of people seem to do is express an interest, but it's a sort of very distant interest in the sense of like, oh yeah, I'm really interested in all that, and I say, well, you know, if you want to learn more about it, and they don't. Yes. So there is that kind of perhaps that barrier in terms of people actually getting involved, and also I don't want to come across like a Jehovah's Witness type, you know, a Jehovah's Witness type character. My wife teases me that I'm in a sect, and whilst she doesn't mean it, and that's obviously not true, I don't know if you get this, but I'm pretty kind of aware that I don't want to be sort of seen like some kind of one-dimensional person who preaches it, because it doesn't work, does it? You know, people have to come to you. That's Smith's lyric, isn't it? You should never go to them, let them come to you. Yeah, because I doubt anyone's kind of going to come to meditation through the you need to do this route. You know,
absolutely.
I mean, if people express an interest, then that's on the table. But you know, that aside, it's probably a good way to clear a pub table, isn't it? Sort of going on about meditation endlessly. I mean, it's self-defeating. I mean, people aren't going to.
Yeah, I think so, and I think I'm really fond of like a phrase that Eckhart Tolle says, which is "be the evidence." You know, because ultimately, in a way, I suppose you could say mindfulness and meditation is still the finger pointing at the moon. It's still not the moon itself. The moon is peace. The moon is loving kindness. The moon is kind of, you know, making the world a nicer place for you, the people around you, and hopefully beyond that as well. So I think that's the real kind of the real point of it. So in terms of how other people respond to me, I would hope that over time I can just continue to incrementally develop kindness and goodness and just be a sort of a positive force in the world.
Mindfulness and meditation is never going to obviously cure diabetes, but how has mindfulness helped you in terms of diabetes?
That's a really interesting one, because, as I say, it was one of the complications from diabetes regarding my eyes that kind of drove me towards this. And so the first thing that it's really helped with is I'm more relaxed physically, which is like quite an important thing. Then I'm more relaxed on a much more sort of profound level about life in general as well, which again folds itself into being more relaxed about diabetes, because firstly, living in the present, as I speak to you right now, I don't feel particularly diabetic. Most of the drama and most of the trauma around my diabetes comes from either giving it values, in other words, saying, why does it have to be me, blah blah, or, you know, panicking about the future, thinking, oh no, I've heard all the horror stories about people losing limbs and going blind and so on and so forth. So living in the present stops all that dead. I don't need to apply myself to sort of those unhelpful secretions of the mind. So that's the first thing. But also, mindfulness gives me techniques with which I can seek to actually reverse the diabetes as well. So a couple of years ago I did what was then known as the Newcastle diet, which is a very low calorie diet, bordering on starvation diet, 8 weeks, and it reverses your diabetes. But what do you do after that? And I did it and it worked. What do you do after that? I spent the 8 weeks thinking I feel incredible, and I did. I felt absolutely superb, but I had nothing to do with it. It was like sort of seeing a beautiful view but no one to share it with, and I thought I don't want to just feel superb for the rest of my life but not be able to socialise or whatever, because I was a real hermit during this time. So where mindfulness comes in is the avoidance of this feeling that life is constantly better somewhere else or somehow else, and the knowledge, the feeling that you know everything comes from within, happiness comes from within, and it is always there. You open a door in your mind rather than a door into the pub or whatever. And so mindfulness, I've just started doing the Newcastle diet again, but this time it does feel different, because this time I'm not feeling like I'm missing out. So for me, mindfulness, in terms of reversing diabetes, type 2 diabetes I should say, it's the missing piece of the jigsaw. It's the it's the mind stuff to go with the body stuff, basically. When I first did it, I was recommended a bit by my doctor about CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, and it recommended kind of writing a little card of what was good for you, and little reminders everywhere about why you should do this and so on, but it didn't connect. And that's where mindfulness kind of works much better for me, is it connects. Mindfulness is something that comes from within, whereas this card was just outside of me and was something that I was trying to connect with but never really did.
So how important is timing in terms of you specifically coming to mindfulness, that maybe perhaps that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Does one have to be completely ready for it, to welcome it into one's life, as it were?
Well, I could only speak for myself. I think something I've learned from diabetes really is that we're all different. There is no one size fits all, perhaps, but I think for me, the timing. An example of how the timing worked for me was I actually got The Power of Now, the Eckhart Tolle book, a few years back. I can't even remember the circumstances in which I was driven to get it, but I read about 5 pages of it and it, put it down, just thought, whatever. And it was only when I started meditating again that I started really getting into meditation and getting something out of it, that I picked it up again, and it just blew my mind. So the book hadn't changed, it was still the same collection of words in the same order, but my attitude to it had completely changed. So for me, it was a question of being open to it, and that openness for me was driven by trauma. The trauma of my eyes being diagnosed as having bleeding behind them, and the consequent domino effects of thoughts that end up with you being blind, and how on earth is your life going to be then, and then maybe your wife leaves you because she can't be fucking bothered to sort of put up with all the terribleness of having that kind of difficulty, and then what happens then? Maybe then I end up homeless because I've got no way of earning an income, and we haven't got a very benevolent government towards disabled people. And before I know it, one little eye test has spiralled into my whole life, kind of becoming destitute, and suicide becoming the preferable option, perhaps.
Yeah.
And
that's a great example of how thoughts can run away with themselves. That you can go from, as you say, one piece of news to
Yeah.
you know, to living out this big tragedy in your life, you know, that.
Absolutely, yeah, and your brain is such a powerful computer that it can do all that in, like, you know, a second, because your brain's trying to protect you, of course. So it's trying to protect you against those eventualities by pointing them out, and that is a result, I believe, of our brains not really kind of having evolved along as quickly as modern society has with technology and so on. So we've still got kind of caveman brains in a modern age. But yeah, on a sort of on a practical level, that's the sort of trauma that kind of made me ready, willing and able to accept accept looking at a kind of looking at meditation and stuff like that. There is another part of this story as well, in that respect, that I've in mixing with alternative culture type people, festivals and all that sort of malarkey, travellers and so on. There is a sort of aspect of there's one kind of people there who are real kind of like airy fairy people who, you know, sort of who I just find enormously irritating, and who I perceived as being into like yoga and other stuff that kind of requires a faith that I don't have. I'm trying to word this quite carefully so as not to be too offensive to people, but I found people in off-putting. I got put off the idea of yoga and that sort of thing because of this sort of subsection of people who were into it, essentially. So I did find it quite that probably, you know, made me waste years of not getting into it properly. Was another kind of progression of thoughts, not from eyesight to homelessness this time, but this time from getting into yoga to like having to spend all my time completely irritated by everyone I was surrounded by.
Has that got a lot to do with the way that things like yoga are packaged and presented in our society?
Totally, yeah. I mean, look on any social media. Look at any social media about mindfulness, and you will see a woman sitting in the lotus position with her fingers touching her thumbs, and
yes,
and that's got nothing to do with mindfulness at all. It hasn't really got anything to do with meditation. I'm not saying you can't do that, and I'm not saying that people who do that are doing it wrong. Obviously, that's not the case.
There's normally a beautiful sunset involved, isn't there?
Yeah, and they're sitting on some rocks overlooking a sort of massive valley or whatever.
Yes.
You know, whereas the reality of it for most people clearly is that this has to work if you're waiting for a bus in the rain in Lewisham High Street. You know, we can't all be sitting in the I can't sit in a lotus position anyway because I broke my leg once. But we can't all be sitting in some kind of yoga position, wearing a singlet and tracksuit trousers and looking radiant, overlooking the Grand Canyon or something. It's just, you know,
yeah,
that's not reality for most people. So I think there is definitely a misrepresentation going on that that just serves to put a lot of people off, and I think there's a sort of selfishness going on there. Actually, there's a sort of this is ours and you can't have it type thing going on in the subconscious,
like a sort of closed society in a way.
Yeah,
yeah,
and like a set of rules that don't actually exist.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
so there's no entry point for perhaps a lot of people feel that there's no obvious entry point. This is something that other people do, other types of people do.
It's certainly how I felt, and I do wonder how many other people out there would get massive benefits from mindfulness, from meditation, if only they felt it was for them. I really, I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, but I would think logically it must be true. There's got to be so many people out there who really need it, who hasn't occurred to, or who would dismiss it, and it'd be really good, and maybe the next stage of everything to get through to those people and to sort of enable them to be open to it and to help themselves.
I suppose some of the most prevailing preconceptions about mindfulness, and number one, I guess it's about stopping your thoughts, which obviously it's not, and the second one, obvious one, is that it's about attaining a state of bliss. Would you care to say anything about those two, and whether you've encountered those preconceptions? And
I had those preconceptions. Well, certainly, yeah. I thought, and I'm sure a lot of people probably think the first thing is I can't just sit there not thinking for an hour. That's absolutely what I thought of it, because when you're looking at someone meditating, I suppose that's what it looks like, isn't it? It looks like they're just in this kind of serene, blank state. Whereas what's going on in your head, of course, is your brain, because you're awake and not asleep, your brain's constantly sort of bombarding you with stuff you're worried about, or stuff that's just on your mind in general. And then, when you get a little bit more sort of peaceful or relaxed, then maybe a whole load of ideas will come up about ways in which you can sort of be improving your life when this meditation's over. And your brain does this, and it's absolutely natural. And I think the other thing I would probably point out to people, what you do with mindfulness is you learn to accept that's what's going on, to accept that the thoughts happen, and then just to return to your breath. And over time, you become you're not like your thoughts get less, is it? But you become more adept at returning to your breath and at not being bothered, and also to do all this without being judgmental. That it's not a competition. Just this. So what you're really learning is acceptance, self-acceptance, loving kindness towards yourself, to sort of accept that all this stuff happens, and then with loving kindness, with compassion, bringing it back to your breath. And I find that over time, I do sort of hit periods over time over a meditation. I mean, I hit periods where I'm concentrating on my breath more, and the thoughts are slowing down. And it's never. That's why I like calling it a technique, really, I suppose, because it's not some kind of way of closing your brain down. It's just a different way of associating with your thoughts and not letting them run away. And that comes back, of course, to this kind of idea that, if you're not doing all this stuff, your thoughts can run away, like I've explained, like I've described a couple of times. So for me, these techniques have been invaluable. And then those things that you're practicing on the training ground of meditation then equip you in life to deal with all sorts of stuff in very different and more skillful ways. The bliss thing, I would say I have encountered moments of bliss. I'm aware that's not that striving for bliss is not what we're doing here, but I do find occasionally moments of bliss there, quite profound, maybe, although this is kind of off-piste a bit, maybe even mystical experiences have kind of happened to me occasionally, but it's absolutely a byproduct, and it's not what it's all about.
Yeah, because I suppose in some people's minds, one meditates to attain a particular state of mind. You meditate to become peaceful, blissed out, chilled out, whatever. Whereas maybe the one thing that people find most difficult to grasp, particularly when they're starting out, is that this isn't a particularly goal-orientated practice. The whole idea of goals seems to be a complicated one in mindfulness.
Yeah, it is complicated, I think, because on the other side of things, mindfulness is dreadfully the benefits of mindfulness are dreadfully undersold, I think.
So there's a danger, isn't there? And if we talk about it as not being a particularly goal-orientated practice, there's a risk of actually underselling its massive benefits. I mean, the benefits that you quite clearly have been blessed by,
Yeah, Yeah, so I can absolutely say this has changed my life, and it has brought me a far higher degree of happiness. It really has. It's made me much, much happier, and it's made me perhaps even more difficult stuff to get, much more content.
And not for very much time investment. I mean, it's not like you're meditating for 3 hours a day, is it?
No. I dare say again, it's different for everybody, but yeah, I mean, I 20 to 30 minutes is probably my average, and I'll miss a day occasionally, and I won't beat myself up about it. I won't even be bothered about it.
Do you notice the difference in a day when you don't meditate?
No, not really, but I have on occasion. I've sort of maybe missed 2 or 3 days, and I start noticing the difference there, and I start noticing the old more negative stuff creeping in again, and so like panicky, worrying type things. So I think it is definitely right to call it a practice. But going back to goals, I think perhaps what's got to be sorted out in the mindfulness world in general really is the difference between striving and intention, where I think it is absolutely, we all have intentions. If there was no intention, nobody would take it up in the first place.
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't take to your bench or your chair, would you? That in itself, I'm going to meditate now, is an intention, isn't it?
Yeah. So striving is a slippery slope, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you say, I'm going to meditate for half an hour now, after which I expect to be happy, I expect to have lost weight, I expect to have
all my
become
problems
richer.
have been dissolved.
Yeah. So that's striving, but intention, on the other hand, I think you can focus mindfulness on happiness, and I think you can use the focused lens of mindfulness to home in on certain things, rather than always having a blanket, choiceless awareness that that you can't focus on anything. So because ultimately we've got to get beyond rhetoric always, haven't we, and beyond dogma, because ultimately what matters here is not mindfulness. What matters here is being happy, is being peaceful, is hopefully contributing towards a nicer and more compassionate world. And if that meant breaking a rule or two in mindfulness, I'd do it, because mindfulness is just a word. I think intention, is an area that could be looked into quite a lot more generally, really, in mindfulness, because I don't see anything wrong with having an intention to be happier.
And at the time of speaking, your mindfulness is clearly has clearly become a big part of your life. You're involved in writing books about mindfulness. You're gearing up to become a teacher, seemingly. Together we've been talking about possibilities of TV shows and all kinds of things. Do you say a little bit about where you see this taking you in life? Do you have clear ambitions about where you want to be in the next few years, or is it more open-ended than that?
I think I suppose the answer is necessarily a bit kind of vague and woolly, because I don't have specific goals, but I would. I suppose yet again we're coming down to the difference between striving and intention. Perhaps I would definitely. I'd like to always sort of to deepen my practice, by which I mean to be present more often and more present when I am present. Both of those things could be quite meaningless if you're new to the concept of presence, wouldn't they? But I suppose I would like to experience a deeper peace, and so on. To try and get a little bit less woolly, I suppose I'd like to help people. The minute I realised what an enormous help this could be, I thought I just want to get more and more into this, but I also want to help open it up to other people who like me would have not considered themselves the kind of people who got into it. I think that's where the real revolution in mindfulness perhaps lies, and if I can play a part in that, that would be fantastic. Like Eckhart Tolle's played a part in it. And going back to something that was touched on much earlier on in the interview, the fact he doesn't use the word mindfulness, I think, is probably a touch of genius, really, because it's not about mindfulness, it's about the stuff within mindfulness. Mindfulness is just a word that, presently is used to associate all these techniques and so on.
It's a massive buzzword at present, isn't it?
It is a massive buzzword, yeah. But Eckhart Tolle's managed to get these ideas through to loads of people without mentioning it. So it's quite interesting. Quite interesting to me that you can do that. I think because I wouldn't. The problem about stuff being a buzzword is it's a good it's a good bit of bait for some people, but it's also probably has the opposite magnetic effect on other people.
Yeah. The idea that this is some sort of trendy thing that's clearly it's not going to go away. Perhaps it will become less fashionable. Newspapers and magazines might write about it less as time goes on. That's possible. It will lose that level of appeal. But and
it also opens you up to a backlash, doesn't it, from cynical people. Just like happened with punk, really. The minute you could define punk, people started containing it.
Yeah.
And the minute you define mindfulness is the minute it starts solidifying and being contained. And I don't think anybody benefits from that. I think it's good to have a structure. I think it's good to have techniques. But rules I'm a lot more kind of dubious about, really.
Do you see? Clearly we've had the sort of mindful revolution, if you like. Jon Kabat-Zinn began his clinic in 1979. He's probably flabbergasted when he stops to reflect just how huge this thing has become on a kind of global level.
Yeah.
But do you see ways that mindfulness can be freshened up, made more accessible, perhaps in some ways? Do you think there's more work to be done in terms of making it more accessible to people, selling up the benefits as opposed to being slightly, I don't know, almost kind of apologetic about that side?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think the divorce of mindfulness and Buddhism is perhaps not complete. I don't mean that in any kind of negative way towards Buddhism, but I think the word mindfulness really came to be as a result of Jon Kabat-Zinn taking the other bits of Buddhism out and just leaving a secular practice. And I'm not massively kind of bothered about it being secular in some ways, but it sits very easily with me.
Yeah. It's all inclusive, isn't it? If you make something secular, then people aren't going to say, well, the Buddhism puts me off. There's really if people can get past their preconceptions and prejudices, they might be amazed, mightn't they, to find out how juicy this practice is. It's not dry. It's not academic. The last thing it is boring, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's it just kind of it opens doors. It opens a great adventure. So it makes life an adventure. Like for me, for the first time since I was a child, life feels magical again. Like when you still believe in Father Christmas and you go to bed on Christmas Eve and there's that magical feeling. There's that is back in my life, but not believing in Father Christmas.
No.
That's not back,
no.
Unfortunately, but because he never comes anymore.
Yeah, that's
right. So I got rid of him years ago.
Yeah.
But that magical feeling is back in my life. That feeling of walking down the road on a summer's day. Like when kids just run just because they want to run because they don't want to walk. Mm-hmm. That kind of lust for life.
Yeah.
It's given me all that stuff, and I think that could be got over to people much more. Like in the same way, I don't know, coffee adverts do or something. Really, except mindfulness delivers more than coffee.
Yeah, it's more than a quick buzz, right?
Yeah, Yeah, it's exactly, yeah, you wake up with it, you go to sleep with it. But at the same time, it's not a cure-all, of course.
Yeah.
It's not a magic wand either. You don't stop having problems in your life. The world doesn't become an alternative universe where wars and terror and so on have deceased.
No, but all the same, it can be potentially, life-changing on a massive scale, this.
Massively, massive scale, yeah. Well, you and me are both living proof of that, aren't we? And,
the poster boys. The punk poster boys of mindfulness, yes. Yeah. It's not
what a thought.
Well, yeah, well, if you'd said to either of us 20, 30 years ago that this would come to pass, we'd have probably dismissed you as stark raving bonkers, but...
Totally, yeah. And I suspect a lot of people who get into mindfulness from, rather than being brought up with this sort of stuff, half the people I interview seem to be brought up like, my dad was a Buddhist monk or something, but the other half seems to have come to it through sort of trauma of one kind or another, be that depression or illness and so on. And those half the people have come to it from, a previous position of not being interested at all.
Yeah.
I think probably everybody would who has come to it via that direction would say that they could never have believed being into it. Like Gareth, who runs the Everyday Mindfulness site, said he was completely sceptical about all this before he got into it, and now he's it's changed his life, and I'm sure loads of people have got that story. We've got that story.
Yeah.
And what we have to, what would be nice to get over to people is that's what it can do for you.
Yeah.
Of course, the skill is to say that without saying this is what it'll do for you.
Yeah.
Because you can't just kind of do one meditation one day and then have your world magically transformed, because it is a practice.
Yes, but in terms of the entry point, I mean, really, fundamentally, all you need is a chair and the intention, right?
Yeah, and a bit of knowledge of the techniques, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which are all out there, out there.
Yeah.
Especially in the age of the internet, because before that, I just went into a bookshop. I got the Eric Harrison book, which is very good, but didn't connect me up the way that in further times the Eckhart Tolle book did connect me up. And the Eckhart Tolle book, I'm sure I came to through the internet.
Right.
So I think the internet is definitely a way forward here.
Yeah.
The way forward, perhaps.
So I suppose the message for anyone listening who's thinking about this is really what's stopping you, right? I mean, there's...
Yeah, well, the answer's always yourself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're the only person stopping you, and you're the only person who can... you're the only person who can change your life. I remember a punk fanzine had written across the top of it, "These writings will not change your life, only you can do that." And that's absolutely the case. But mindfulness gives you the techniques to change your life and to change the way you think about everything and to change the way you feel. And ultimately, if I'm anything to go by, certainly it's just to make you a damn sight happier and more profoundly more content.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful place to come to rest. Gerard, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Cheers.